Good morning. This is the Blaine's World podcast, where conversations are worth having and seeing. You can watch us each week on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. You can also listen in on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And for more information about past shows and present shows, future shows, you can go to our website, which is behind me, blainsworld.net. I'm your host, Blaine Greenfield, coming to you from my Zoom studio in lovely downtown Fairview, North Carolina. Each week, we share positive news and uplifting stories about people and organizations in both West North Carolina and throughout the country. And toward that end, it's my pleasure to introduce Trish Rocks, a nurse, and Jan Booth, nurse, and both RNs, end-of-life doulas and authors for being my guests today. And folks, you can feel free to wave to all your fans and friends who are watching this. So give them a big wave. That is a big wave. There we go. Okay. I should mention that Trish Rux is an end-of-life doula educator, nurse, coach, faculty member at the Conscious Dying Collective and registered nurse with inpatient hospice experience. She offers a background rich in the study of death and dying and the practical knowledge from being at the bedside of hundreds of dying people. She's a co-author of Dying Matters, 8 Conversations That Change Your Life, and of course we'll be talking about have in front of me. Jen Booth has worked as a nurse for 40 years. And Jen, what, you started when you were 7? Was that it? To get
I
this
was 8. Yeah, I was
eight,
just 8. Yeah,
youngest
very young.
nurse ever impressed in the hospice, palliative care, and end-of-life coach, doula, and educator. She serves as faculty for the Conscious Dying Collective, a death doula training program of the Integrative Nurse Couch Academy, and formerly for the Art of Dying Institute's Integrative certificate program. She presents workshops in end-of-life planning and the transformative possibilities of end-of-life care. So let me ask you both, first of all, first time I meet with somebody, I ask this question, and I'll ask you, Trish, in terms of as a kid, you grew up where, Trish?
Say that again, please.
As a kid, you grew up where?
I grew up in Anoka, Minnesota, which is the Halloween capital of the world.
The Halloween, what makes it the Halloween capital?
We just decided it back in the 1950s, and ever since then, it's been this big thing with 2 parades and a pumpkin bowl football game, and it's just a big deal.
So when you were growing up in Minnesota there, did you always know you wanted to be a nurse?
I did not always know that. I was always really curious about death and dying, but the nursing thing came a little bit later. I always was interested in science.
Okay, so you became a nurse then, and how did you then, since you kind of mentioned it, how did you then become interested in death and dying?
I was curious about it even as a small child and found out that I could talk about death and dying with people and that not everybody could do that. And I feel like that's kind of a superpower these days.
Okay, and even as a kid, were you able to talk about death and dying as a
Yep.
child?
Yep. My dad was kind of a naturalist sort of guy, so death was part of the circle of life and didn't shy away from any questions or conversations about it.
Okay, and what's really cool that your dad did that because so many parents, unfortunately, don't involve the children at all, or they don't talk about it, or they just ignore it, I guess. I guess it's kind of sad when then somebody passes or dies that they don't know how to deal with it. Is that oftentimes the case?
Yeah, and some people don't even let their kids go to a funeral
Yeah.
where that's an opportunity to be with other people and see what really happens and be part of the community of mourning.
And so I'll ask the same questions of Trish, excuse me, of Jan, if I can. Yes, child, Jan, you grew up where?
I grew up in New England, in New Hampshire, and then down in Virginia, outside of Washington D.C. So both places through my childhood.
And as a child, did you also have a desire to become a nurse?
No, was nowhere on my radar. I didn't even know what a nurse did. I mean, I was so ignorant when I ended up in nursing school. I'd been in Peace Corps and had been working in West Africa with midwives, and I was so taken with the work that I thought I want to go back to the States. I want to become a midwife. And while I was in nursing school, I had a very strong realization that what I really wanted was to be you might say, a midwife for the dying to work as a hospice nurse. And that was just clear as a bell.
And I love that concept. I never quite heard it said that way. It's a midwife for the dying. Um,
Yeah.
Great concept. When did you get into it? In nursing school, or did you study that in nursing
Yeah,
school?
I had, like Trish, we have a lot of similarities with these interests. My dad was a minister, and he was very open around funerals and talking about dying. And in our church, when I was in high school, I was part of a Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, when her book first came out on death and dying, a part of a book group, as a teenager. In many ways, I had no business being there. I'm not even sure why I was there. I don't even know if I had anything to offer. But clearly, when I look back, kind of like Trish, I see these kind of breadcrumbs that were leading me. I've always been fascinated by transitions. I think that's why I was drawn to the birth part of being a midwife. These really momentous parts of being a human. I wouldn't have said this as a kid or a teenager, but looking back, I'd say I'm drawn to these really essential parts of being human, especially the parts that people don't talk about it as much. And also, I, like Trish, have a compassionate heart that likes to be able to support people in hard times. And I got clear early on that most people just don't know what to do around dying. We've really gotten detached just fairly recently. You might say the past 50, 60, 70 years, we've really gotten detached from a lot of the rituals of caregiving in extended families and being with people who were aging and dying, and after death care rituals and things. So all of that really fascinates me. Like, how can we reclaim some of those really important parts of being in human community together
So the
that I
question,
think we've lost. We've
so
lost
the
a lot of
question,
it.
question I have then, I'm curious, in that you both don't live close geographically. How did you meet Trish, or how did you hook up with each other?
So we both teach doula training programs, and we met as teachers for those programs. And then we started doing some side conversations and classes with people. Padma and her husband actually took one of our classes online. And we just had this magical collaboration going with each other. So we've known each other since 2018.
Well, it's funny you
I
mentioned
think
that,
so.
Trish, because now I do recall discussions I've had with Padma when she was Padma. We're talking about a mutual friend of ours, Padma. The last name is Devine,
Divine, yeah.
Divine, and she told us about this course she was taking. And it was a strange. She was taking this online course, and who would ever have thought it's an online course? But she loved it. And the two of them, her and her husband Will, were telling us about this. And so you met them through that online course, and you met Jan through this through work you were doing. So when did you start work? And you also mentioned you were a doula, and for the folks who don't know what that is, if you can explain what that is, Trish.
Sure, sure. So an end of life doula, a lot of people know what a birth doula is,
Right.
somebody who supports the mama. And we support and advocate and educate at the end of life the same way that a birth doula does that supporting. And it's for the person who's dying and their family, their loved ones, their friends to be present for them. And it's a real range of things. So advanced care planning, like the classes that we give, and walking with people when they have a serious illness, vigiling at the end of life, preparing the body after death, and doing rituals and bereavement with the family and friends.
And so let me ask then, Jan, the idea. So you hooked up or somehow you met this other woman who had this similar kind of interest as you. Jan, when did the two of you, decide to write a book?
Well, we'd been doing classes like with Padma and her husband and many others, and they were great classes. They were like 20 to 30 people at a time, really good conversations. And both of us, one night after a class had finished, we were talking about how it feels like such a drop in the bucket. And we know how important these conversations are. We know from classes, we know just from being out in the world, how many people just feel completely unprepared, don't know kind of where to start with all of this. So we thought, well, wait a minute. What if we wrote a book that was intended to be a conversation starter? And, it's like you could give someone a book to say, here are 8 really good, juicy conversations that have to do with how we as people can together walk through this time in a different way that doesn't feel so full of fear and doesn't feel so confusing and so medicalized. So, what would be the conversations we'd want to have? Among friends and family and your partner, your book club, a work group that is particularly close or something. So we started imagining how can we stimulate these conversations and decided that really a book was a good way to do it, to then put it in the hands of people and say, you don't need us. Really, because we've put some of the just very basic wisdom of things we've learned about why these conversations matter, we've put them in the book. And we've given some really good questions for people to take themselves and think about and chew on and talk about with the people in their lives. So that was the evolution of trying to kind of move our own experience and our own passion for these conversations out to more people.
Now, are the two of you still doing this course online?
We're not doing the classes like we used to, but we're still teaching in a doula program, but we're not doing the classes right now like we did with Padma and many others, because we sort of see this book as the next evolution. And in some ways, you might say a better use of our time and other people's time to be able to do this on their own rhythm with the people in their lives. Not
Yeah.
that we wouldn't ever teach again like that, but
Because
it
I'm
really was
thinking
a wanting to move the knowledge more into people's communities.
when you were teaching the course, was it during COVID?
Mhm.
Because
Yeah.
it's I just can see, even though it's a useful thing to read the book, I was just think it would be also a useful thing to take the course, or even it could be online, but in person. And so I asked Trish then, in terms of teaching the course, so you do seminars, you do lectures, do you teach the course in person as well? Or are you still
I,
teaching the course?
well, I started out teaching the course in my home in
Right.
really small groups, in over 4 to 6 weeks kinds of things. And now I give different lecture kinds of things. But Jan and I have recently been talking about, well, maybe we should do a series with the deeper, deeper questions, deeper dive into things. And so I don't know that we'll really ever stop.
Because, because personally, I'd love to have you do the series because I can see it, even though you can read the book. But the beauty of this would be the discussion,
Yep.
I would think. And to have it, like, again, Padma and Will had told me about it, it would be fascinating to kick this around with other people who probably also never even thought about it beforehand, and it's like an
Mhm.
aha moment. Um, so
Really, we get lots of good ideas from everybody, and we learn every time that we do it as well, whether it's on Zoom or in person. That exchange of ideas and people really thinking over, well, what is important to me? And then talking about it with each other.
let me ask you this, in terms of if somebody's watching this or listening to it, encouraging people to buy the book or to take a course if you ever do it again, how do you broach that to like loved ones? In other words, how does a child or grandchild say, this is going to be next year's Christmas gift, but we're
Stocking
laughing,
stuffers.
right? We're laughing, but it's so needed, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And like when my parents were alive, I don't know if they would have ever bought this book,
Yeah.
which is a shame. But how do you encourage somebody else to buy the book? Or you were
Yeah.
laughing, but for your Mother's
Yeah.
Day or for stocking stuffer or something, how do you get somebody? How do you put it in their hands?
That is the $1 million question, Blaine. I mean, that's what I feel like I've spent 40 years trying to understand better of what are the doors, to go through to open these conversations and which are the doors that shut down conversation, right? Because there's just so much in our general US culture. There's just so much resistance. And I would include in our healthcare system as well. Unfortunately, among our colleagues in healthcare, there's not a lot of skill in opening these conversations. So that's really the big question. And I think one of the things that has become more clear to me, and Trish and I share this, we talk about this a good bit, which is um, even though we're talking about a kind of holistic preparation for the last part of life, like how can we do this more openly and normalize that this is something every one of us are going to do? How can we do this in more of a community sense and with less fear and confusion? But really, the part that I think we don't talk about enough is that when we have these conversations with the people in our lives, it brings us closer. Because really, what we're talking about are what are my values? What are my priorities in living? What matters most to me? Like today, what matters most to me? How do I want to spend my time? I mean, these are life questions. These are the kind of questions that life coaches and health coaches ask people, right? So we're really encouraging this idea of making conversations about living and dying and our priorities, helping to make them a much more natural, normal thing that we do as people. And it's not just trying to kind of pretend like we're not talking about death. It's just putting the end of life conversations into a much bigger context about this is part of the human journey. Can we get a little more at ease with this, because it's something we'll be walking ourselves, we'll be walking with, everyone that we're close to. So it's that normalizing and bringing it into life, and not like our life right now, and not just kind of having it off to the side like some booby prize that we all get to when we move into the end of life. How do we hold it up as a vital, purposeful stage of being a human development?
Well, let me ask you then, Trish, if I can, in terms of starting this discussion, and that's probably the toughest thing. How do you start it? In other words, um, I bought the book or somebody bought the book and you've read it, but how do you get somebody else to read it? How do you get Trish, a loved one, to read it? How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, I think the important thing is that starting the conversations with just baby steps. And it could be something like, hey, I picked up this book and they talked about the different kinds of things you can do after death, burial and cremation and donation. And what do you think about that? It's pretty easy to have that kind of conversation and then go from there. Here's what I've been thinking, and I want you to know this about me. That I would prefer a green burial, or I want a home funeral, that sort of thing.
So, what would be the first question to ask?
What are the things that are most important to you in your life? Those values, and how do you make decisions? And if you're going to be the person that is the healthcare power of attorney or agent for somebody, it's important to know what they want. And we can't plan for every single scenario. There are lots of gray areas. But if I know your values and I know what you would want in certain situations, then I can extrapolate that at the time if it's needed.
I'm thinking out loud as you're speaking that this would be a great book to also get in the hands of lawyers,
Mm,
and you'll see I throw out lots of ideas all the time, and my background's in marketing. And I would
Hmm.
think that this would be a great book for lawyers to have because, again, when I developed my will, my lawyer never discussed a lot of this stuff,
Right.
with me. In other words, talked about the legal aspects of it and the financial aspects, but never some of the nitty-gritty stuff, and I'm surprised the lawyer didn't discuss about that, how do you want to be buried? How do you want, whatever the case is. So this would be powerful for those folks to get a copy of this book. Um,
Well, in fact, Blaine, it's interesting because on our website for the work that we do together, which we'll share with you later, We have these downloadable one-page information for all kinds of different professional groups of
Right.
how they might use this book, right? Like elder care. We have elder care attorneys, elder care professionals as one of the groups, and funeral directors, and healthcare professionals, and faith community leaders, and nurses, and hospice and palliative care, and doulas, and et cetera, et cetera. And because exactly what you're saying, that we're all a part of this somehow. And the more we can each kind of hold up and say, can we have these conversations a little more easily? I think that's part of what we're seeing happening in our country right now, is that there's a whole kind of groundswell to talk more openly about these kinds of things. And one other thing I wanted to say is that, one of the ways into conversations is often to relate it to something that's happening in your life. Like, let's say you've got a good friend who is seriously ill, and her partner won't talk to anyone about it, right? And
Right.
is really struggling but won't talk to anyone. So and let's say the person who's seriously ill is trying to have a conversation with her partner, but he won't speak, right? So one way in is to say, I've noticed what's happening with Dave and Marcia, and it really breaks my heart. And I just want to say that I don't want you to have to be in that situation. I want you to know what's important to me, and I want us to talk about it like we've talked about all kinds of important things in our lives, right? So you use something that's happening in your life that you can relate to, including movies or stories in the paper or a TV show or something on the Pit. Yeah, because they've been doing some really great stories on the Pit lately, this new hot TV show. So
Well, it's,
those things are like a really good way in. Takes a little of the pressure off because it's out here, those people there, and what would be important to me when I think about that.
since you mentioned this, let me ask you both. Is there any good one day to begin this or start this? In other words, and I'll tell you what I used to do, but I'm curious, Trish, your reaction. I'm curious, Jan's. Should you just wake up one morning and say, this is going to be the day we're going to discuss this? Or is it a holiday, or is it Mother's Day? Is a good time to begin these discussions?
Again, I think just those small mini discussions are the best. There is a movement for April 16th to be Healthcare Decisions Day.
Oh,
And
interesting.
so some people do it then, some people do it at the Thanksgiving table, on your birthday, whenever you're together. So there's big ways to do it, but there's little ways to do it too. And the thing is, all of those ways are a gift that you're giving to the people that you love and love you, to know what to do so they're not burdened with decisions and not knowing. That's what Jan and I both saw in our work as hospice nurses, is so many families getting to the end of life, not
Mm.
sure what their person wanted. And then they can't speak to that person anymore or understand what they're saying. And
Well,
there's family conflicts that can come about, and just, wow, I wish I knew, and I don't.
this discussion reminds me of a discussion I had ironically with my ex-wife, and it was we actually called it a day. It was a contingency day, and
Hmm.
so it was the
Mm.
day after Christmas. The thought being everybody was kind of in a good mood or happy, whatever. So that would be a good time to discuss with folks, and not only and I'll ask both of you this question. So it's not just the will, but there's a lot more to this discussion. And I asked Jan if you can kind of summarize. Said, I mean, we have a whole book on it. But
Yeah,
aside from the will, what are the other things that folks should be kicking around?
yeah. Some of the paperwork, are the pieces of paper and the legal documents that people are more familiar with, like an advance directive that says, if I was not able to speak for myself, who would speak for me? Just kind of what Trish was saying a minute ago. And being thoughtful about that and making sure that person knows what matters to me. And the second part of the advance directive is the living will, which says, if I was in a vegetative state or I was terminally ill and not going to get better and my heart stops, I do or I don't want it artificially started, right? So that's kind of what we're most familiar with in our current healthcare system, are the advanced directives, and then our will, which is separate, the the distribution of our things and our money and our assets. But what Trish and I spend a lot of time talking about is the whole period of time before that, because I think the context for all of this is that it is complicated to die in current US medical system. It's complicated because we can extend life in some unusual ways, which in some cases is really great, and in some cases is really complicated. And many people have seen this kind of medical technological dying where someone is on a ventilator machine and not there at all. And no one wanted that to happen, but it just all kind of happened because no one knew what was important to that person. And so this whole idea that it's hard to die, which I think most people in healthcare would acknowledge, how can we then make this easier so that all that end of life last minute paperwork really does matter, but what about just all the living with serious illness and making complicated decisions about, do I treat this, do I not, do I what is switching from a focus on cure to a focus on comfort, when would I do that, what are the examples in my life of people who have made decisions like that, and how does that feel to me? Am I someone who wants to, as much as possible, allow a natural death when my body is dying? Am I someone who wants to fight as much as I can? And what does that mean for the decisions being made? So actually, it's really important to be, that's why we talk about it's never too early, but it can certainly be too late. So even though I think that's kind of the pressure a lot of people feel is like, oh, it's too early. Someone just got a serious cancer diagnosis. I don't want to talk about this because it'll make it sound like we know she's going to die. But what if we were to change that, paradigm and say it's actually a really healthy thing to talk about what is the compass that I'm following here in these complicated treatment decisions. Yeah.
Aside from when we talk about the legal stuff and the medical stuff, but does part of this come into play, Trish, in terms of discussions you have? Do you also talk about the funeral and what you want said at your funeral and who comes to your funeral? Do you get into that as well?
We do. We talk about the after death care and what matters there. So lots of people don't know the different disposition of the body, things that are coming about now. And people have probably all been to a funeral that didn't feel too good. And
Right.
then they've been to a funeral that's like, that was uplifting and really full of love and care. So, how do you choose that for yourself? What kind of songs, what kind of readings, who do you want there? Do you want people in colorful clothes? It doesn't have to be all somber, right?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because, yeah, my wife and I sometimes discuss that kind of thing. And then a big trend, I don't know if you folks have seen this now, but I love it. Some people are making obituaries kind of humorous. I don't know, have you ever
Yes.
seen that? But I love
Yes.
that, don't you? And you read about them, and that's kind of a fun thing to read. That and actually, is this strange for the person himself or herself to write their own obituary? Do you have that
Yeah.
happen?
Yeah. We really think that's a great idea to at least put down the things that are important to you to be in there. Um, but the ones that are funny, that just cracks me up.
And
Yeah.
how
Well,
about
especially when it's consistent with who the person was, a
right?
person with a great sense of humor who was always, kind of finding the funny side of things. What a great way to kind of end their life. It's like part of their legacy, right? He was always, we were always laughing when we were with him, even in his obituary, right? It's like the sort of final legacy.
Yeah,
It's
but you're giving me food for thought because again, haven't had a lot of these discussions, but what's so interesting about what you're saying, Jan, is that that little prompt, the first questions can start into all these other things. But isn't it kind of cool that both are smiling and I'm smiling, that this doesn't have to be a morbid discussion, you know?
right.
I guess when you're healthy and you're completely there for yourself and for others, that's a great time to have the discussion as opposed to when you're completely out of it.
Right. Or so exhausted by caregiving or exhausted by treatments or scared and trying to make a decision in the midst of an ICU when you're afraid and the family has never talked about this and all we're feeling is, grief, and do what you have to do so that he doesn't die, even though he said very clearly, I don't want to be on a machine. They're just so many things we each saw of these kind of last minute crises that were heartbreaking. They really were heartbreaking because there were so many missed opportunities for families, for couples, for friends to have what could at the time feel initially hard. But once you kind of break past that feeling of we shouldn't be talking about this, there is this like big meadow of wonderful conversations that may have tears, may have laughter, may have a lot of shared memories. I mean, there's a whole kind of developmental piece to this, a kind of life review that is very helpful to everybody because it bonds us. We get to talk about our friendship of 50 years or, talk with our kids about things we especially loved about each other. And we don't have to wait, like some Hollywood movie, because when we wait, most people aren't really in great shape to be doing that. And what did we miss for all those months and years of connection that we could have had?
What's fascinating about what you're both doing, and trying to think it out, is Trish in terms of being a doula. So I never quite thought about it in terms of a doula for the dying. But how does that work, Trish? Do you sit them down? I guess in person would be best, but it could be done over the phone or on the computer. How does that work?
I like doing that work in person
I
the
would
best, but
imagine.
it can be done over Zoom or on the phone. But it's leading the person through that idea of, what are your values? And if there are things that are conflicting values, which ones have priority for you? Who do you want to care for you? Who do you think will be there to care for you? And how can you build more support before you get even more sick or that sort of thing. So those conversations and then working with the person and their family as they need more support. So I'll help people sometimes find caregivers in the community that can um, help them decide about hospice care or palliative care, that sort of thing, and then help them plan out that funeral
And the
service
beauty,
if they want.
the beauty I would imagine of having the both of you there, or one of the two of you there, is that you're also kind of an impartial third party to the process.
Yep.
Right.
I mean, it's just I'm thinking about it in very positive terms. That it'd be nice to not have to lead the discussion yourself. I mean, you can tell them to get the book, but wouldn't it be nice if somebody else is asking the questions or kind of guiding them in the process? Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's right. And especially around things that are hard or poignant or where there might be conflict, we often will, I'll hear myself say something like, it's not unusual for families to have very different experiences of grief. And you can sort of normalize that this is hard for everybody, right? You can sort of share from your experience that, it's sort of like you're not the only family, right? Meaning, this is hard, so we take some time to talk about these things together because many people don't have a lot of experience being kind of close into someone who's dying, right? You've maybe had a couple people. Maybe you were the main caregiver. Maybe you were kind of a few steps away, but it's still so unfamiliar because we have moved so far away from more of a sense of being involved more in each other's lives in small communities or extended families where we saw this. So there's a lot of education and kind of normalizing with people because we kind of outsourced a lot of this over the last 50 years or so, hospital or nursing home or funeral home, or we just don't talk about it because it's uncomfortable.
Well, you talk about it so on target because you talk about it with your lawyers, but you don't talk about it with your family,
Isn't that fascinating?
Mhm.
Yeah,
Because I've had to have a great lawyer, but you never talk about some of the important stuff, but you talk about
right.
the financial stuff. But this is oftentimes more important than that. You both also talk in the book about community death care. And what exactly is that?
Go ahead.
Trish,
Sure,
okay.
yeah, I'll go and then Trish. So the idea is that we've become very isolated from each other, and that many of us don't have the same support to care for us as we get older and need more help. Again, we're not in those extended families like we were, and in those small communities where we knew each other more. And there's also, unfortunately, there's becoming more and more of a shortage of available home care help, right? And there are plenty of people who are aging alone, or that maybe they have adult children, but the adult children live elsewhere. So this reality of who will care for me is becoming a big concern for many of us. And we've seen it maybe in our own parents' generation and our caring for them. And we're wondering, how is this all going to happen? So this idea of community death care is not to say we're going to go back to when we all lived in smaller towns and rural areas with extended families. We're not going back. Life has fundamentally changed in our country. But how do we, in small ways, build more and more of that way upstream, that care? Who are the people in my life who might help with some very basic chores when I'm not able to? Who's someone that might go with me to a medical appointment and take notes while I'm there? Who's someone that can drive me to my chemo at the oncology center? Just thinking through, how do we step up more for each other, and how do we ask for help and kind of recreate what used to happen a little more naturally. And that is building this sense of a death caring community. And one other thing I'll add is looking around and saying, well, actually, what is in my town? What is in my city? What are the hospices? Who are the home care agencies? What have my friends done who have gone through this? Are there doulas in the area? Are there faith communities that, or maybe my faith community that I'm a part of, that has a group that really helps support people who are seriously ill? So it's a rebuilding of care around us.
And I imagine it's particularly important for single folks, in terms of, and we'll talk about in two steps, that single folks don't necessarily have that community built in, or, may not have it. And then also we talked off the air, and I asked Trish about this as well. It also becomes increasingly important as some folks get older and dementia sets in, and that throws a curveball into the process. So
Right.
I guess, Trish, back to what Jan was saying about the community care, it's best to talk about that when you're healthy and can deal with this, as opposed to putting it off.
Right. Right. And I have a super good example in my
Please.
own life. There's about 20 of us that have known each other through a meditation group, and we said we will support one another through serious illness. And right now, one of our members does have a serious illness. One of the things we do for everybody else is take each other to our colonoscopy appointments and our cataract surgery appointments and to the airport, that sort of thing. But that give and receive kind of balance with one another, paying it forward sort of thing. And yeah, I can watch your dog while you go on vacation. I can pick up your mail. I can go to the pharmacy for you after your surgery. Little things like that. And then that develops into some bigger caregiving.
Well, I'm fascinated about what you just said. I just love the idea then, as opposed to even just having one person or best friend,
Yes,
or he or she
yes,
gets sick, what do you do? But I love that idea you shared with people to kind of, I guess, work and develop a community of other folks who could. I just love that idea. I don't think I've heard it before, but what a fantastic idea for
Yeah,
people to think about when they're again, back the point being when they're healthy, not
right.
when they're not
Mhm.
healthy.
Yeah,
there's a book called Share the Care, and that they outline that model. It's really an easy idea. And the point being to have enough people so no one person is overburdened. And the
right.
person who needs care doesn't feel bad asking because people have stepped up and said they're willing.
Okay, let me ask you both perhaps the most important thing, since we've talked about it. So if folks want to get your book, She talked about the book, Dying Matters. And again, great title, Eight Conversations That Can Change Your Life. What's the best way to get the book?
You can get the book on Amazon. We're self-published. Here in the Asheville area, the Firestorm Co-op bookstore is consigning the book for us. And if you're local to Jan in Boulder or me in Asheville, give us a call and we can meet up with you for a book.
Well,
And
and
also, Trish, you want to give the website so that they
Yep.
could also have the downloadable forms we talked about.
So we have a website, deathdoulas.com, and we have a page for the book. So we'll put this interview on there, and then we have these downloadable PDF forms that Jan talked about. We have some testimonial kinds of things and just information about the book.
okay.
And a link to the Amazon
Yep.
webpage where they can
And,
buy it as
and
well.
perhaps most importantly, Jen, since I have you here, if folks want to get the book, we talked about getting the book. If they want to contact either of you to either get work with a doula or find out how to find a doula, what's best bet, Jen, to reach you? And then I'll ask Trish as well. What's best bet?
Well, yeah, one thing we found the easiest way is to use the same email, which is info@deathdoulas.com, DEATH, and then doulas is DOULAS.com. And that way, then we can, if it's something that's more pertinent to me or more pertinent to Trish, we can always respond with our own emails. But we just found it easier to have all emails go to that one place, and we can be very responsive. Part of our work for both Trish and I, we wrote a book about conversations because that's really our focus in many ways right now is opening up these conversations. So we are open to people, sending us emails, communicating with us, asking questions. Info@deathdoulas.com.
Okay, and also, Trish, if they go to that website, do they also they can read about your respective backgrounds there as well? If they want to find out more about you, is your background on
Oh,
that website?
we don't really have that. We have the information on the book and it has a small biography for both
Okay,
of us there, but we don't have an expanded presence
okay.
on
Well,
that
anyway,
website otherwise.
I'd like to thank you both for being my guests on this edition of the Blaine's World podcast. I'd also like to thank my producer, Cappy Tassetti, and hopefully one of these days, at least with respect to Trish, we'll bump into each other in the Asheville area. That would be fantastic. But
I
thank you,
hope
thank you,
so.
thank you, thank you,
Thank
thank
you,
you.
Blaine.
This was
Thanks.
fantastic. I really appreciate
It
it.
was fun. Thank you.
Okay.